are a mix of heaven and earth. What is very interesting about the story of the creation of the humans is that there are actually two versions of the creation in this section. First one is found on chapter 1, verse 27, and then the second is found on chapter 2, verse 7. So let me read you very quickly what the first one says. The first one says, "Vayivra alehim es adam b'tzamo b'tzelem alehim bara oso zachar u'nekeva bara osam." And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Okay, that's the first one that we have. The second one, in chapter 2, verse 7, we have Vayitzer Adonai Elohim es ha'adam afar min ha'adama Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim Vayihi adam lenefesh chaya. The Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. We can learn a lot about what it means to be human from these two verses. Rashi explains that when the Torah says people were formed from the dust of the earth with God blowing the breath of life into us, it's telling us that God made people of both earthly matter and heavenly matter. The body of the earthly, the soul of the heavenly. Rabbi David Kimchi, more commonly known as the Radak, who was a 13th century French Torah commentator and grammarian, points us to the detailed language used in the verse. It says, God blew into Adam nishmat chayim, the breath of life. And what happened to man? Man became a nefesh chaya, translated as a living being. Nishmat is a form of the Hebrew word neshama, which is one of the words for soul. Nefesh is another word for soul. And so the Radak explains that nefesh chaya is the life force, something we have in common with all animals that roam this planet. But the neshama is a uniquely human soul, a gift given to us directly by God. Now, there are many Jewish legends about the golem. Who's heard of the golem? You heard of the golem? Yeah, you heard of the golem. Good, okay. The golem being created from mud that has no soul. The Talmud in Sanhedrin says that when Adam was created, he was first a golem. He only became a person when God blew into his soul into him. So he was created from afar, he was created from the dust, he was a golem. And then God blew into his nostrils and made him a living being. In Masechet Sanhedrin, in the tractate, Talmudic tractate Sanhedrin, we were told that Rabbi said, if the righteous wish to do so, they can create a world, as it says, and I'm going to quote you here, but your iniquities have separated between you and God. A righteous person without iniquities is like God and can create worlds. The story, where it's quoted in the Talmud, the story continues that Rabbi indeed created a man, but it was a golem. And what did Rabbi do? He sent his creation to Rabbi Zera. And Rabbi Zera, when seeing this creation, tried speaking to him. But he got no reply. And Rabbi Zera told the golem, you were created by one of my colleagues, go back to your dust. And then, of course, there is the most famous golem of all. Which golem am I referring to?
Frankenstein.
Oh. No, not Frankenstein. Oh, no. The most famous golem of all was the golem of Prague, created by the Maharal of Prague in the 16th century to protect the Jews. And in fact, if you visit Prague, they will point to the attic where they say that the golem lays to this day, although nobody's allowed in to actually see it. So, if we are a blend of of heaven and earth, how do we express our heavenly side? How should that manifest itself? We show the heavenly side of us when we walk in God's ways, as we are commanded to do in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26, verse 17, when it says, "You have declared the Lord this day to be your God, and to walk in his ways, and to keep his statutes, and his commandments, and his judgments, and listen to his voice." So the question is, how does one walk in God's ways? The Talmud explains as follows. The Talmud says, is it possible for a human being to walk after the Shekhinah, the divine presence, in other words, God? For has it not been said, the Lord your God is a devouring fire? The meaning is to walk after the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be he. As he clothes the naked, and the Lord, we read it actually in the Torah today, and the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife coats of skin, and he clothed them. So in other words, what attribute do we have to do? We have to clothe the naked, those who are in need. Then it says, the Holy One, blessed be he, visited the sick. When did he visit the sick? The Lord appeared to him in the plains of Mamre. Who was he talking about? Abraham. And Abraham had his bris. God appeared to him. He said, so too, you should visit the sick. And then it goes on to say that the Holy One, be he, comforted the mourners. When did God comfort the mourners? Nichum Avelim. The Torah tells us. And it came to pass, after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son. And so we too are required to do Nichum Avelim. It is the comforting of the mourners. And then it goes on to say, the Holy One, blessed be he, buried the dead. When did God actually participate in burying of the dead? Well, we just read last week the burial of Moses. What did God tell him to do? To come up on Har Nevo, on the mountain. He's going to where he's going to die, and God will take care of him. And so too, we are required to bury our dead. In other words, we are godly. We are expressing the heavenly side of ourselves when we show compassion to other people. Now, the New York Times is usually thought of as a bastion of secular liberalism, to put it politely. But an opinion piece from the paper's editorial board earlier this week expressed this most Jewish values of compassion of others. Iran is struggling with a rising death toll from the coronavirus. 29,000 dead in a country of 82 million. They managed to flatten their curve for a few months, but since the beginning of September, new cases have been increasing. Iran's death toll is the worst in the Middle East, and the country has been struggling to buy emergency medicines. The US government's response has been to oppose a $5 billion loan that Iran requested to help fight the pandemic and to put even more sanctions on Iran. This policy is doing great harm to the average Iranian and is doing nothing to stop the leaders of the country who have had currency, who have hard currency and can ride out the sanctions in relative comfort compared to the masses who suffer. Barbara Slavin, who is the director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council, calls the American maximum pressure campaign against Iran sadism masquerading as foreign policy. She says, most civilized countries in the world will find ways to be compassionate, even towards citizens of countries with whom they are at war. The editorial points out that in 2003, when an earthquake killed tens of thousands in Iran, then US President George W. Bush sent an airlift with rescuers and medical supplies and eased restrictions on sending goods and money to Iran. Bush said, American people care, and we've got great compassion for human suffering. It's right to take care of people when they are hurt. When the civil war was at its worst, at its height in Syria, what did Israel do? Israel couldn't go into Syria. But Israel set up a field hospital in the Golan Heights on the Syrian border solely to treat Syrian refugees, even though Israel and Syria are technically still in a state of war. Hundreds of Syrians were evacuated to Israeli hospitals for medical treatment. For the most part, Canada has not had much of a policy towards Iran. We've generally gone along with what the Americans do, not feeling that we have vital interests of our own at stake in Iran. But at a time when there is such a high level of suffering by ordinary citizens in Iran, perhaps it is time that Canada did forge ahead with its own policy. In 2015, Justin Trudeau campaigned with a pledge to restore relations with Iran, but apparently Iran is no longer on the government's radar. The New York Times editorial also called on the Iranian leadership to show compassion and release political prisoners who are at risk because of the fierce spread of the coronavirus in that country. The plight of political prisoners in Iran is showcased by the case of Nasrin Sotoudeh. I don't know if you know who I'm talking about. He is an Iranian rights lawyer jailed in Tehran's notorious Evin prison. She was sentenced to 38 years in jail for simply defending, as a lawyer, a group of women who took off their headscarves in public to protest the law mandating headscarves. So Sotoudeh went on a hunger strike for a month to call attention to the human rights activists jailed in Iran and to demand the compassionate release of political prisoners to keep them safe and healthy. The Jewish tradition teaches us that we have an obligation to clothe the naked. We also have an obligation to judge others with mercy. And if we do that, it just may lead God to judge us with mercy. After all, we can always tell God, hey, give us a break. We gave others a break. If Iran showed some mercy towards its political prisoners, perhaps other nations would be more moved to feel the Iranian government is deserving of mercy. The first story of the creation of man tells us that we are created B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image. What does it mean to be created in God's image? The rabbis are very clear that this does not mean that God looks like us or we look like God. It is not referring to a physical image. What makes us godlike is our ability to choose, our free will. And as we are at the start of a new year, we have a clean slate. And may God strengthen our resolve to choose to walk in God's ways, to choose to be compassionate towards all of God's children, regardless. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.